Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm excited to be painting this Aspen Forest painting with you guys today. It is on a round canvas, but you can also use whatever shaped canvas you have. And of course you can always use whatever supplies you want, but I'm gonna go over the supplies I use in this video and they will be linked in the description box below. I have all basic Liquid-X paints, white, burnt umber, which I'll refer to as brown, primary yellow, blue, and red, as well as black and phthalo cyan green. And as for brushes, I have an angular brush, a fan brush, a Scruffy brush, so I have two of these, a large flat brush, and a detail brush. And that's all I use for the whole painting. I do have this tool for stirring and mixing paints. And of course you'll want your palette, a jar of water, and a towel of some sort, paper or normal, whatever you want. And so I think now we're ready to get painting. First, I start by mixing some blue and white to create the background sky color. I cover the entire canvas in this. Don't forget your edges if you want to paint those. Now this video is sped up, so feel free to slow it down in your settings bar or pause it as much as you need. Now while the background is still wet, I took some white and blended it into the sky to create a soft, cloudy, bright sky. Next, I took some green and mixed it with a bit of brown. I took my large flat brush and shaped the bristles into a very fine line in order to dab this color across the horizon. These are very distant trees in your painting. Don't be like me and let your sky cloud background dry before starting this layer. I didn't because I was trying to be quick and ended up making my life a pain. So I would suggest letting each layer dry in between before the next layer. Mixing some white, brown, and black, I made the color of the very distant trees. For these trees, I am using a detail brush. This would be another time you want to make sure the background is completely dry before starting to save yourself some heartache. Then I mix a little bit of the color we just made with some black to make it a bit darker for the next tree. This painting took me a total of about 3 hours, so don't worry if it takes you some time. This tree has tons of branches. Adding these branches will make your tree look more realistic than just if you added foliage. Now I will go back into a lighter color and pop in a few smaller trees from far away. Next, I mix my green mixture with a lot of yellow using my large Scruffy brush. I dab it along the lower part of the faraway trees. Don't worry if you have to reload your brush a bunch. I did too, but edited most of it out due to it taking too much time in this video. I do this all the way to the bottom of the canvas, then I add a little more yellow to my palette and dab it in the certain areas of the top section. Let this section dry before moving on to the next tree. Next, dip your fan brush into the dark green color we made and add in a big pine tree. Start with just a dab on the edge of your brush at the top of your canvas, then adding a little bit more to your brush as you make your way down the canvas till you're using the entire brush, then dab the brush back and forth. This fan brush is also meant for oil paint, but it adds the best texture for this type of tree, better than any of my acrylic paint fan brushes. Using the same color, I added foliage to the other tree we painted. I do clumps around where the branches are. Next, I add a little brown to my brush to make it slightly darker. I had a few more trees on the other side of my canvas. The first one, I used the lighter tree color we made earlier. The second one, I used the darker color. I mix an orange color for my smaller tree using red, yellow, and a bit of brown and green to dull it a bit. Using the edge of my fan brush again with the orange, I added it to the smallest tree. Then, using my detail brush again, in the darker tree color, I started adding branches to this larger tree. Since it's a larger tree, it will have lots of branches and some will be big and reach very far. The branches on this tree go all the way to the ground. For the foliage, I darkened the green color a bit more with brown and used my fan brush once again, dabbing the entire brush in clumps around the branches. Don't cover everything, you still want to see your orange tree in the background. Then I added some highlights to this tree by adding a little yellow to my green color. Then with this same color, I added a quick pine tree on the other side of the canvas. Here's where I stopped for today and came back the next. I have very short periods of times where I can work on paintings due to having 2 little ones. But this is a great stopping point because the next thing we are going to start working on is our aspen trees. I mixed a tiny bit of black with a lot of white, making just the slightest gray color. I also made a gradient of light gray to white on my palette so I could use different varieties in my aspen trees. Using my angular brush, I dipped into the lighter white and started my first aspen tree. It is very small and further back in the background, but the light is shining brightly on it. I try to be fairly careful about making the tree pretty straight because aspens are pretty straight, but they do still have some curves and things like anything in nature, so you don't have to make sure they are perfectly straight. A few branches are added to the top of this tree. If your white is not covering the background, add another layer of white to any and all of the aspen trees we make if you need to. Be sure to let your tree dry first. Then with a detail brush, add the smallest amount of black and put little dots and horizontal lines to your tree until about 2/3 of the way up. After that, the details become too far away to see. I had another aspen tree right next to it, doing nearly the exact same thing as the first tree. My next tree has a little bit of a larger gap in between the trees. This tree is also a bit shorter and starts its branches a little lower. I use green mixed with a little black and a little yellow. I dab my Scruffy brush around where the branches are. Then I added quite a bit more yellow to my green to add highlights to these leaves. Then lastly, do the most yellow for the final dab. Then onto my next aspen, which is closer, making it bigger but still following the same pattern as these last trees we made. However, it does not have branches because it is closer. Then I will add another aspen tree overlapping the big pine tree we made. I made all of these trees end at the same area because I will be covering the bottom of these trees with foliage later on. These next trees I add are still aspens but much smaller and darker. I mix together a slightly darker gray and make sure my angular brush has a very nice flat edge. Then, with a little water on my brush, I add the color to it ever so lightly. Then I start from the top with a very thin line, making my way down. Then I go back and add lots of small thin branches. I thicken the bottom with some white gray color. This is when I go back with my detail brush and add those fine lines on the 3 aspen trees we just made. The last darker trees get less than the other 2. Now I mix together a brown, white, and gray to make the next tree. This is like that last tree that is shorter and has a lot of branches. Then I make another tiny one right next to it. Again, I mix a yellow-green mixture that is heavy on the yellow. I use my Scruffy brush again and dab where there are branches. Adding a few lower areas where there might be some branches hanging off the bottom of the tree. Lastly, I add the highlights that are basically just yellow on these trees. Now to add a few more aspens. This first one is larger and closer to the front. It overlaps with our big tree on the left side of our canvas. For this, I am using my angular brush again and using a brighter white gray. I make a similar one next to this tree. It is a little further back, so it is smaller and slightly darker. Now I go back with my detail brush to add the black details to these trees. Next, I mix some brown and red together for some details to the foliage at the bottom of the canvas. Sorry, the bottom of the canvas was cut off. All I did was add these brown lines across the bottom. This part is not too important as it will be covered mostly up. Now I mix some green with a little brown and mostly yellow. Then to the side I'd add a lot more brown. I use my Scruffy brush to dab some of this brown mixture onto the canvas. Then I mix together lots of green with brown. I do the same thing with my Scruffy brush. Then I mix a brighter orange with red, yellow, a bit of brown and white. Then I add this in patches. I am so sorry, my camera did unfortunately die, but I still wanted to upload this because I worked so hard on it. So you only missed a few minutes. All I did during this time was take the colors that we had previously mixed and used my fan brush instead of my Scruffy brush to create the foreground. I did the bright orange color mostly at the bottom of the canvas, and then added some of the darker green intermingled with the orange and a little higher up. Then lastly, I took a bright yellow-green color at the topmost areas. I also added another aspen tree that will be our closest tree. It still needs another coat, so I'll show you that. Then I add way more details to this aspen because it is the closest tree. I do the same thing with our detail brush and black paint. Then before I get too high up, I take my angular brush and get it wet. I go lightly over the black areas I just made with my detail brush. I think this adds a bit more texture to my tree. Then I keep doing this pattern up the tree until we get about 2/3 of the way up. Then I go back with my detail brush and add the finest details. I add some small ones up at the top too, but not as many because this is farther away and harder to see. About 1/4 from the top, I add a few dark branches. I just use the black and the detail brush for these. I start by making a large black ovalish shape where the branch will come out of the tree, and then paint the branch. I add a second one coming out of the tree just a little lower. Last, I mix some gray, brown, and add a little bit more of those sticks in the foliage at the bottom. I hope you enjoyed painting this with me. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button so you can see all my latest videos. Thanks, and see you next time.